the stories that they told us when we were children, about primitive people being idolatrous, about the gods of the pagans being idols, were certainly not innocent stories, despite the innocent narrators. They were stories told for a reason. And the more recent stories, about the state idol of those who care about everyone, about the material idol of those who struggle for bread, about the body idol of those who know about tenderness, with less innocent narrators, are stories told for a reason. The true idolatry is not that of non-believers, is not that of atheists, who are often those who destroy idols and are fighting against idols. Idols are the gods of oppression. Idols are the shining fetishes, with divine names and broad smiles, with creeds, with worship, with prayers, with laws, with sacred and divine power, power to oppress, power to exploit, power to kill. The dominators, the idolatrous, will never make the mistake of declaring themselves atheists of their idols. God, homeland, and family, tradition, family, and prosperity. The family that prays together stays together, without work, without food, without housing, without good health. In God we trust. Amen. We spend a lot of time with the idols of death and the God of life, and I could spend so much more. The essays I haven't covered are all well worth exploring, but I wanted to finish this series with the final essay in the book, called The Faith of the Poor in Their Struggle with Idols, in which Brazilian theologian and sociologist Hugo Assmann takes a look at the poetry of the masses, the revolutionaries, and makes an argument for letting them seize the memes of production. A few months ago, John Darnielle of the band The Mountain Goats had a Twitter thread on socialism and Christianity that concluded with the line, "I'm pretty sure socialism is about halfway to the kind of radical world Jesus encouraged us to dream." I was reminded of that tweet in the first few lines of Assmann's essay. Quote, "No one gives final lessons, but rather it is up to everyone to move from action to reflection and to turn from reflection back to action. And it is, in particular, a learning that is always open and inconclusive, though it is conclusive as to the necessity of taking in turn every step along the way." Much of Assmann's essay focuses on the use of religious imagery, particularly Christian imagery, in the art and advocacy of the poor of Latin America. Assmann, of course, takes the time to point out that the particular Christian nature of this religious imagery is a byproduct of history, of the fact that the colonizers of Latin America were Christians who used their religion as a theological justification for the atrocities they committed. A few changes in the history of the Iberian Peninsula could have left the conquistadors as Muslims and Latin America then as well. Christianity wasn't the impetus for the atrocities. That was capitalism. But it was the justification, and another major religion could have acted as that vessel. Nevertheless, Latin America was made Christian, and that Christianity can be used to liberate against the idolatrous Christianity that had been imposed. Now, while much of the revolutionary spirit of Latin America is expressed in Christian terms, Assmann is also quick to point out that the revolutions are not Christian themselves. Quote, "It is an entire people, the majority of whom were Christian, that set forth to make a revolution without affixing Christian adjectives to it." And while the majority of those involved with the revolution were Christian, often with the support of their priests and bishops, he adds, "Let no one be deceived. The old ties of certain sectors of the church with certain sectors of the ruling class, call for vigilance to thwart any resumption of manipulation of the Christian faith against the forward march of the revolution. And indeed, we can see those old ties frequently in the history of the U.S., from 17th and 18th century preaching that slaves must obey their masters, to 20th century pastors union busting from the pulpit at the behest of local capitalists, and 21st century sermons on how invading Iraq was the godly thing to do. Even a few weeks ago, I had a street preacher tell me that capitalism is based on the Bible, and that my shirt, emblazoned with the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verses 52 and 53, was demonic. Assmann speaks against the Christianity that wants to judge the religiosity of the masses as not Christian enough, or, as the poem I opened with suggests, as idolatrous in their own desire to better their material conditions. He argues instead that faith must be living and lives in those masses. In the most traditional and sound Christian theology, no one has faith because of the mere claim of belief in God. From the biblical perspective, the question of whether or not one has faith is not resolved in the rectory or the seminary, but rather in the realm of action, where the collective love and hope of human beings materialize. It is a preeminently practical matter. The verbal husk of Orthodox creeds is worth as much or less than the verbal husk of the most routine Lord's Prayer recited by someone while sleepwalking. It all depends on the mediating role that this or that religious formula or this or that recourse to religious symbology plays in putting the love and hope into practice in a social, organic manner. The Church, in all its institutional forms, has no mission other than that of channeling the motivation and actions of human beings toward the path of materializing love and hope. He adds, this obviously cannot be accepted by those who conceive of love for God as something so spiritual that is not required to materialize in the social, organized love for one's neighbor, and in construction of a more comradely society, because they do not understand it. In that manner, Assmann echoes Augustine's hermeneutical priority of love. He wrote in On Christian Doctrine, whoever then thinks that he understands the Holy Scriptures, or any part of them, but puts such an interpretation upon them as does not tend to build up this twofold love of God and our neighbor, does not yet understand them at all. Assmann, of course, is arguing for a much more concrete understanding of love than others who read Augustine might, saying, it cannot be understood by the theologians who talk about hope as if it were a bundle tied to one's back, an obligation, and not the decision to risk testing the limits of the possible, and to resolve that the only real, genuine thing for those with hope is to strive so that what is not yet real, work, food, housing, and joy for everyone, will come into existence as a tangible reality and a collective benefit. Assmann also adds that it's not just the theological orthodoxy, upper realm, that denigrates the religiosity of the poor, but also Orthodox Marxists who conceive of actions and practices associated with the struggle as infrastructural when they are natured from an irreligious stimulus, but as superstructural from the time when religious motivation goes into effect. Both orthodoxies are meant to manipulate the poor, but the people are what the people will be. Religion can be an opiate, but it's also a protest against the current state of the world, and even Marx himself recognized that. What this leads Assmann to is a call for the masses to expropriate the means of symbolic productivity. He uses the same inspiration as the modern parlance, which would go more like, seize the means of production. Essentially, he argues that religious imagery and motivation has been hoarded by the ruling class just as much as capital and production has. But Marxists have, instead of seizing them, simply rejected them, deactivating the God of the poor by imposing irreligious slogans on a revolutionary but believing people. Where this religiosity exists, it should be encouraged and activated, leaning into the anti-hierarchy, anti-oppression, hopeful, revolutionary nature of the teachings of Christ. Amid the very complex web of a people's religious language, it is possible to discover a symbology and a religious self-expression that are intrinsically, not accidentally, revolutionary. In a confrontation with the religion of the dominator, an oppressed people, by expressing its faith linked with a historical action, carries out a process of expropriating the means of symbolic production held by the oppressors. This expropriation process entails the exposure of the contradiction that exists between the uses of the same religious symbols in a society comprised of opposing classes. Wow. I opened with a poem called Modern Idolatry, written by Assmann, part of a cycle called The God of the Rich and the God of the Poor, which compromises part 1 of the final section of the book. Part 2 are poems written by revolutionaries that use religious imagery or focus on the conflict between the author's religious faith and that same faith, at least in name, that has been used to oppress them. Che Guevara writes, "Old Maria, you are going to die," finishing with the stanza, "Rest in peace, old Maria, rest in peace, old fighter. All your grandchildren will see the dawn, I swear it." Nicaraguan political leader and poet Fernando Gordillo writes one called "What Do I Know About God?", which starts, "What do I know about God? And after all, what does it matter to me? I see the powerful giving a kick in the pants to whomever they please because the idea occurs to them. There are dogs that eat better than humans, and I see anxious faces peering over garbage cans, faces expecting to find the treasures of Sinbad, and the powerful come to me talking about God, as if they had put God in their hip pocket. Don't bother." And then there's the song and poetry of the Nicaraguan peasant mass, written, as I shared last week, in the community of Solentiname in Nicaragua. This piece, in Assmann's words, speaks of the God of the people. It is called Entrance Song, and I'll finish with it. "You are the God of the people, the human, unassuming God, the God who sweats in the street, the God with a weathered countenance. That is why I speak to you as my people speak, because you are God the laborer, Christ the worker. You go hand in hand with my people. You struggle in the countryside and the city. You line up there in the camp so that they will pay you your day's wages. You eat, scratching there in the park with Lucidillo, Pancho, and Juan Jose. And you complain about the syrup when they don't put much molasses in it. I have seen you in the grocery store, sitting on a stand. I have seen you selling lottery tickets without being ashamed of that job. I have seen you in the gas stations, checking the tires on a truck, and even traveling highways with leather gloves and overalls. Wow.